Thank you for joining me today. It's a pleasure to introduce you to Dimerix. My name is Nina Webster and I'm the CEO and Managing Director of Dimerix. For the purposes of today, I would like to share a few slides with you to walk you through the Dimerix opportunity. Just jumping to about Dimerix. So we are, as I mentioned before, a publicly listed company. We are based in Australia and we're working on treatments to improve the lives of patients with inflammatory diseases, including kidney and respiratory disease. Our lead candidate is a product called Dimerix 200, and it is currently in phase 3 clinical sites across 70 sites globally. And this is on the back of some very promising data we saw in our phase 2 data. We've seen some very consistent and encouraging efficacy data, but also just as important, if not more important, is a very strong safety profile we've seen with that as well. For those of you not familiar with FSGS or focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, it is a type of rare kidney disease, and it means that some sections of the kidney filtering units are scarred. And over time, more and more of these kidney filtering units become scarred. Sadly, it affects children as young as 2 years old, as well as adults. And for those who are fortunate enough to get a kidney transplant, typically around 60% get reoccurring FSGS in the transplanted kidney. So it's a very poor prognosis, with end-stage renal failure, typically within 5 years. Now, on the right-hand side of this slide, we're looking here at how a healthy kidney functions. So this button here, essentially the kidney works as a really, really effective filter. So it filters the blood and essentially screens out all of the protein. So a healthy person should have no protein in their urine. What happens is as the kidney becomes damaged over time and scarred, it becomes quite leaky and you end up with protein spilling into the urine, and we call that proteinuria. I mention this because this is one of the measures that we'll be talking about later, because protein in the urine is a measure of how your kidney is functioning and how fast kidney is declining. Just in terms of that market, there's typically around 210,000 sufferers of FSGS across Europe and US. And typically the retail price of orphan drugs is around $7,000. Putting into perspective, it's typically about 80% of next available treatment, in this case being dialysis, given there are no therapies approved for FSGS anywhere in the world. This is a very compelling proposition. So what's been happening in the renal space, because this is quite a hot area at the moment. And there's certainly a saying at the moment that has been more change in the last 24 months than there have in the last 24 years. So for over 20 years, there was absolutely no innovation in the kidney space. This was predominantly driven by the lack of public policy, but also the long and expensive clinical trials that needed to be conducted. So again, historically, clinical trials ran to hard renal endpoints, which meant when the kidney failed. And as you can imagine, that could be decades long and thousands of patients. What happened in 2018 is the FDA, EMA, and various kidney organizations got together to talk about what we call surrogate endpoints, which are alternatives to those hard endpoints to measure the rate of kidney disease. And now you can do kidney studies in a couple of years instead of a couple of decades. In terms of those policy changes, in the US in 2021, kidney disease cost the US healthcare system $88 billion. $55 billion of that was in end-stage renal failure, typically dialysis. So in 2019, there was an executive order issued by the White House that provides incentives to the physicians to delay the onset of kidney failure as much as possible, essentially to try and decrease that $55 billion deficit. What's happened because of these changes in public policy, as well as those regulatory changes, meaning those clinical studies are far more manageable, is there's been a real increase in interest in the kidney space. And so now looking at the timeline, this is since January 2020, so around the start of COVID. It's funny how we now use COVID as that flag in the timeline in the sand. There's been a lot of activity and a lot of transactions in this space. Now, what you're looking at here is typically the darker the circle, the closer it is to the Dimerix proposition. So whether it's the green boxes you're looking at there, regional, whether it's phase 1, 2, or 3, whether it's renal or multiple. So darker the circle, it's a phase 3 study in renal, very close to the proposition for Dimerix. Now, touching on really briefly how this works, 3 key mechanisms in sclerotic kidney disease. Touching on point number one is hyperfiltration or hypertension. So the kidney's working really, really hard and it builds up pressure. That causes point number two, which is inflammation in those cells. Because that pressure is ongoing and persistent, the cells become inflamed, and that causes a fibrosis or scarring of those cells, causing point number three, those specialized cells within the kidney are died off. As they die off, you come back to point number one, you've now got less cells, they're working even harder, causing point number two, even more inflammation, causing more loss of cells. So you can imagine that you go around faster and faster as you have fewer and fewer cells filtering the blood, until such time that you have insufficient cells and you're in kidney failure. Now, the current standard of care is what's called an angiotensin receptor blocker, and it works on point number one, it's an antihypertensive. And we know that our drug, DMX 200, is a CCR2 antagonist, so it works on point number two on the inflammatory pathway. But what was really important is recognizing how they work together. So you imagine these two receptors sitting side by side on the kidney. If you block the first receptor, the second receptor is not only remaining open, it does what's called upregulate. So you end up getting more signal coming through. The reverse is true as well. If you block the second receptor and not the first, you end up with this upregulation and more signal coming through. Therefore, what we have identified is if you block both receptors at the same time, you get a far more complete response. And this is what we've seen in all of our studies to date, from preclinical right through to our phase 2. In terms of the competitive market at the moment, there are only 2 companies in phase 3 clinical studies for FSGS. One of them is us, DMX 200, and the second one is a drug called sparsentan, which is also an angiotensin receptor dual antagonist. Now, as I mentioned on the previous slide, if you block both of those receptors at the same time, you see a far more complete response. And sparsentan is that angiotensin receptor blocker that can work very synergistically with DMX 200. We've already got data to demonstrate that we would likely see the benefit of our drug in addition to sparsentan. As such, we consider that this will be very much complementary rather than competitive, which will be a great outcome for the patients in this space. So DMX 200 specifically, it is a small molecule, it's a new chemical entity, and it has a capsule that is given twice daily, 1 capsule in the morning, 1 capsule in the evening. We do have orphan drug designation in US, Europe, and UK, which provides a number of incentives with that as well. In terms of our experience to date, we've completed 4 clinical studies. Across all 4 clinical studies, we've seen very promising and consistent efficacy data, but we've also seen a very strong safety profile across all of those. In 2020, we completed our phase 2 clinical study. We were very, very pleased to see 86% of patients see a benefit on our drug versus the placebo. We also saw a clinically meaningful drop in protein in the urine. Remember, that's the measure of kidney disease progression, in addition to the current standard of care on the angiotensin receptor blocker. And it was this data that got our medical advisory board really excited, and we moved into the phase 3 program. So the phase 3 clinical study is designed as a single study. It's a single phase 3 clinical study. It is designed as a randomized double-blind placebo-controlled study. Patients are brought into the study, recruited, and then put into this stabilization period. So there is a period here where all medications, including that angiotensin receptor blocker, are all stabilized. Patients can also be on SGLT2 inhibitors and low-dose corticosteroids. Once they've completed background medications stabilization, they are then randomized straight 1-to-1 on either drug or placebo. Now, the full study takes us through to 104 weeks on the eGFR, or glomerular filtration rate, which is the kidney function. But we've also built in 2 interim analysis points. The first of which is a blinded analysis after the first 72 patients on protein in the urine. And that is anticipated in mid-2023. So we're certainly within that 12-month period of a data point in a phase 3 clinical study, which is really exciting. The second analysis is what we would call that accelerated approval analysis endpoint. What we're looking at here is 144 patients. So that's the first 72 plus an additional 72. That will be looking at both protein in the urine and its relationship to eGFR. If that data looks good, we may submit for an accelerated approval at that point, given we do have that orphan drug designation. And in the background, the study would continue to the full clinical endpoint. The study is currently recruiting across 11 different countries, including the US. We do have an open IND, and we are actively recruiting in each of these sites for part 1, and we anticipate completing recruitment end of October, beginning of November. In terms of that recruitment status, we're actually, as we sit today, day of recording, we're at over 50% recruited on that clinical study, and we anticipate, based on current predictions and appointments, that we would complete the first 72 recruited by end of October, certainly beginning of November, which puts us on track for that interim first analysis in the middle of next year. So a snapshot of our corporate overview. We currently have a market cap of around 45 million Australian dollars. Our cash burn is somewhat lumpy because we are in a clinical trial. And so we expect that the biggest expenditure has already happened in opening those clinical sites, and then we will continue with our slow burn through to the end of that study. And we have a share price typically of 14 Australian cents on any given day. In terms of what else is happening within the business, just looking at our development pipeline, we've talked today predominantly on our phase 3 flagship program in FSGS. We also have diabetic kidney disease coming in behind. We completed a phase 2 study in 2020, also with very encouraging data. We are in 2 COVID studies. These are investigator-led studies where they have taken DMX-200 to put into those patients. As and when that data is released by the investigators, we will, of course, report that to the public market as well. And coming in behind that, we have DMX-700 in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or COPD. COPD, of course, is the 3rd largest cause of death, and the only one of the top 5 with increasing mortality rates. We were extremely pleased in June of this year to announce that we saw an 80% decrease in lung injury against control on DMX-700, which was statistically significant and very encouraging. So we are now planning the next steps of our COPD program moving forward. Because we're based on a proprietary platform technology, we do have a number of other identified opportunities as well, as and when we have resources and funding to bring those into the pipeline. As you can see, we're extremely busy within Dimerix. We have a very active portfolio, each of which is commercially attractive and very compelling, and we look forward to reporting that in due course. Thank you for listening, and I wish you a good day.